There is a building on Sunset Boulevard that has witnessed more romance, more betrayal, and more power than any palace in Europe. The Beverly Hills Hotel stands at the corner of Sunset and Rodeo Drive, wrapped in salmon pink stucco and surrounded by 12 acres of tropical gardens. When it opened in 1912, Beverly Hills did not exist. There were no movie studios, no stars, no industry. There was only dust and bean fields and one man's impossible dream. The hotel would become the throne room of American celebrity, the place where empires were built over breakfast and destroyed by sunset. It would host presidents and gangsters, legends and frauds, artists who changed the world, and criminals who nearly ended it. For more than a century, fortunes have been made and lost behind those pink walls. Affairs have flourished in the bungalows. The Academy Awards have been born in its ballrooms. And through wars, scandals, boycotts, and threats of demolition, the building has survived. This is the story of the Beverly Hills Hotel, Hollywood's Pink Palace. In 1906, the stretch of land that would become Beverly Hills was nothing. Dirt roads cut through abandoned bean fields where Mexican laborers had once harvested crops for the ranches that sprawled across the coastal plain. The occasional pepper tree offered shade to roadrunners and ground squirrels. Los Angeles proper ended miles to the east. The movie industry did not exist. Hollywood was a temperance community of modest homes and church socials. But one man saw something different in that emptiness. Burton Green was a Michigan-born oil man who had come to Southern California in 1900 seeking petroleum beneath the dusty hills. He found none. What he discovered instead was land, 4,000 acres of it, purchased as the Rancho Rodeo de las Aguas. When oil drilling produced nothing but dust, most investors wanted out. Green proposed an alternative. They would subdivide the land and create a new kind of community, a place designed not for farmers, but for wealthy Easterners seeking sunshine and status. In 1906, Green hired the landscape architect Wilbur David Cook to lay out streets following the natural contours rather than the rigid grid that dominated Los Angeles. Cook's curving boulevards would give the development an air of established elegance, as if the community had existed for generations. They named it Beverly Hills after Beverly Farms in Massachusetts, where wealthy Bostonians summered. But Green understood that no one would buy homes in a development that existed only on paper. He needed something to anchor the community. He needed a hotel. Green approached Margaret Anderson, a Los Angeles businesswoman who had made her fortune managing apartment buildings downtown. Anderson recognized opportunity. She agreed to build and operate a luxury hotel on a 12-acre site at the corner of Sunset Boulevard and what would become Rodeo Drive. The location was strategic. When automobiles became common, Sunset would be the main artery west. Anderson commissioned the Los Angeles architect Elmer Gray to design the structure. Gray had trained in the Beaux-Arts tradition, but understood that Southern California demanded different aesthetics. He proposed a building in the Mission Revival style, a romantic interpretation of California's Spanish colonial past that suggested history, permanence, a connection to the land that nouveau riche clients desperately wanted to purchase. Construction began in 1911. The hotel would contain 325 rooms, arranged around interior courtyards in the Spanish manner. The main building stretched along Sunset Boulevard, 3 stories of reinforced concrete clad in salmon pink stucco. Gray chose the color deliberately. Pink would photograph beautifully. It would stand out against brown hills and blue sky. It would be memorable. The grounds mattered as much as the building. Anderson hired landscape crews to plant 12 acres of tropical vegetation that had no business surviving in a semi-arid climate. Date palms from Egypt, banana trees from Central America, birds of paradise from South Africa. The effect was deliberately exotic, a fantasy of eternal springtime maintained by constant irrigation from wells drilled deep into the aquifer. The total cost approached $500,000, equivalent to roughly $15 million today. For 1912, this was an extraordinary sum to invest in a hotel located in the middle of nowhere. Anderson was betting that nowhere would soon become somewhere. The Beverly Hills Hotel opened on May 12, 1912. 7 months later, the surrounding community would incorporate as an independent city. But on opening day, Beverly Hills remained a real estate speculation. Only a handful of homes had been completed. Most lots stood empty. Guests arrived by automobile or took the Pacific Electric Railway's red cars to Santa Monica Boulevard, then hired carriages to travel the remaining distance up dirt roads. The opening ceremony attracted Los Angeles society, which in 1912 meant ranchers who had struck oil, merchants who had profited from the city's explosive growth, and a handful of wealthy Midwesterners who had relocated for their health. The Los Angeles Times praised the hotel as a triumph of California architecture. What the Times could not predict was that within 3 years, an entirely new industry would emerge just miles away. In 1915, D.W. Griffith released The Birth of a Nation, a technically revolutionary and morally reprehensible film that demonstrated cinema's power to move mass audiences. The movie industry, centered in New York and New Jersey, began its migration west. Southern California offered year-round sunshine, diverse landscapes, and cheap land for building studios. Within 2 years, Hollywood and the surrounding communities had become the capital of American motion pictures. The Beverly Hills Hotel was positioned perfectly. It offered privacy, it offered luxury, it offered proximity to the studios rising in Hollywood, Culver City, and Burbank. And it offered something that mattered more than anything else to people whose faces sold tickets: discretion. Margaret Anderson understood her clientele. She instructed her staff never to acknowledge celebrities by name in public spaces. No autograph seekers would be permitted on the grounds. No photographers in the dining rooms. What happened at the Beverly Hills Hotel stayed at the Beverly Hills Hotel. This code of silence would become the foundation of the hotel's reputation. The first movie star to discover the property was Douglas Fairbanks, the athletic leading man who would become one of the biggest names in silent film. Fairbanks checked in shortly after the hotel opened and immediately recognized what Anderson had created. This was not merely a hotel, it was a refuge. In 1919, Fairbanks married Mary Pickford, America's sweetheart, in a ceremony that made them the most famous couple in the country. They honeymooned at the Beverly Hills Hotel. Their presence gave the property a celebrity endorsement that no advertising budget could buy. Within a year of that honeymoon, the hotel's guest registry read like a catalog of American fame. Charlie Chaplin took a suite on the second floor. Gloria Swanson held court in the dining room. Rudolph Valentino, the smoldering star whose death in 1926 would cause mass hysteria, maintained a permanent residence. Will Rogers, the cowboy philosopher whose homespun humor made him the highest-paid entertainer in America, lived at the hotel for months at a time. The architecture facilitated the privacy these performers required. The main building contained standard hotel rooms, but the real prize was the collection of bungalows scattered across the 12 acres of gardens. These detached structures, some containing as many as 6 rooms, offered complete separation from the main property. A star could entertain guests, conduct business, or carry on an affair without ever entering the public spaces. The bungalows had their own entrances, their own phone lines, and enough distance from neighbors to ensure that whatever sounds emerged would be absorbed by tropical foliage. Margaret Anderson retired in 1928, selling her interest to a group of investors. The property continued to thrive. By the late 1920s, the Beverly Hills Hotel had established itself as the unofficial headquarters of the movie industry. Stars lived there. Directors held meetings in the lobby. Producers brokered deals over lunch. The stock market crashed in October of 1929. The Great Depression that followed devastated the American economy, but Hollywood proved surprisingly resilient. People still needed entertainment. Movie attendance remained strong throughout the 1930s, and the Beverly Hills Hotel benefited from the industry's survival. While other luxury properties across the country closed their doors, the Pink Palace on Sunset Boulevard stayed open. In 1941, the hotel changed hands again. A group of investors led by Hernando Cortright and Ben Silberstein purchased the property for $1.5 million, approximately $31 million in today's currency. Cortright had previously managed the El Mirador Hotel in Palm Springs and understood the peculiar demands of celebrity clientele. Under his management, the Beverly Hills Hotel would reach its absolute peak. Cortright's first innovation was the Polo Lounge. Prior to 1941, the hotel's main dining room served meals in the formal European style. Cortright recognized that Hollywood power brokers preferred a more casual atmosphere for their business dealings. He converted a small bar off the main lobby into an intimate space decorated with English-writing memorabilia. The name was pure marketing. There was no polo field nearby, but the sport connoted wealth and sophistication. The Polo Lounge opened in 1941 and immediately became the most important room in Hollywood. Studio executives held breakfast meetings there to discuss casting and budgets. Agents negotiated contracts over lunch. Screenwriters pitched ideas to producers over drinks. The round leather booths offered just enough privacy for confidential conversations while remaining visible enough to signal your importance. To be seen in the Polo Lounge meant you mattered. The room developed its own rituals. Booth 1, closest to the entrance, was reserved for the most powerful people in the industry. Louis B. Mayer, the ruthless head of Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, claimed it as his personal territory. When he entered for his regular breakfast, the staff knew to seat him there without asking. The hotel's phone system became legendary. In the era before cell phones, the Polo Lounge maintained a network of phones that could be brought tableside on long cords. A businessman conducting a deal could take calls without leaving his booth. Witnesses reported seeing powerful men juggling multiple handsets simultaneously, negotiating 3 separate contracts while their eggs grew cold. Darryl Zanuck, the head of 20th Century Fox, conducted so much business at the hotel that he installed a direct phone line from his office to his regular booth. When Zanuck was in the Polo Lounge, which was nearly every day, his staff knew exactly where to reach him. The menu itself became part of Hollywood lore. The McCarthy salad, invented by the Polo Lounge chef in the 1960s, consisted of chopped greens, turkey, cheese, and avocado mixed tableside. It became the signature dish, ordered by executives who wanted a meal substantial enough to fuel hours of meetings, but light enough not to induce drowsiness. The salad remains on the menu today, essentially unchanged. Beyond the Polo Lounge, a trial train na Mamie's Beering. The hotel continued to serve as a residential address for Hollywood's elite. Howard Hughes, the eccentric billionaire who would eventually descend into paranoid madness, maintained multiple bungalows simultaneously during the 1940s. He used them as offices for his various business enterprises and as hideaways for the actresses he was courting. Hughes would remain a fixture at the hotel for years, his increasingly bizarre behavior tolerated because his money remained good. Elizabeth Taylor lived at the Beverly Hills Hotel during multiple periods of her tumultuous life. She occupied Bungalow 5 so frequently that the staff began calling it the Elizabeth Taylor Bungalow. She recuperated there between marriages. She entertained lovers there between divorces. The hotel also attracted visitors from beyond the entertainment industry. Presidents stayed there. Foreign dignitaries maintained suites during visits to California. Business tycoons from the East Coast discovered that a week at the Beverly Hills Hotel opened doors that remained closed to them in New York or Chicago. The property had become more than a hotel. It had become a symbol of arrival. But the glamour was not without cost. The same privacy that protected stars also concealed darker activities. Affairs flourished in the bungalows. Illegal gambling operations ran out of certain suites with the staff's silent cooperation. Drug use, though rarely acknowledged publicly, was an open secret among longtime employees. The hotel's policy of silence protected everyone equally. A star caught with someone else's spouse could trust that the night manager would not call the gossip columnists. A producer conducting negotiations that violated antitrust laws knew the hotel phones were not tapped. The Beverly Hills Hotel had become a kind of Vatican for the entertainment industry, a sovereign territory where normal rules did not apply. The property reached its cultural peak in the 1950s and early 1960s. These were the years when the studio system still controlled Hollywood, when a handful of executives could make or break careers with a single phone call, when being seen in the right place at the right time could change your life. And the right place was almost always the Beverly Hills Hotel. Marilyn Monroe maintained a standing reservation during her years in Hollywood. She would disappear into the bungalows for days at a time, emerging only for film shoots or carefully staged public appearances. The hotel staff learned to anticipate her needs without being told. Fresh flowers delivered daily, champagne chilled to exactly the right temperature, enough privacy to hide from a world that would eventually consume her. Frank Sinatra treated the hotel as a second home during his Hollywood years. He held court in the Polo Lounge, surrounded by the rotating cast of celebrities and hangers-on known as the Rat Pack. Dean Martin, Sammy Davis Jr., Peter Lawford, and Joey Bishop would join him for marathon drinking sessions that stretched from lunch into the early morning hours. The management tolerated behavior that would have gotten lesser guests ejected. Sinatra's money and fame bought him immunity. The hotel also attracted figures from the darker corners of American life. Sam Giancana, the Chicago mob boss who would later be linked to CIA plots against Fidel Castro, stayed at the Beverly Hills Hotel during his trips to the West Coast. He conducted business in the bungalows, meeting with studio executives who needed his cooperation to keep their lasso. Vegas casinos running smoothly. The overlap between Hollywood and organized crime was never discussed openly, but it was never entirely hidden either. In March of 1964, something happened in Bungalow 8 that would haunt the hotel for decades. The exact details remain disputed, but the outline is clear. A woman was found dead. The death was ruled accidental. The police investigation was brief. No charges were filed, but rumors persisted that powerful people had been present when she died, that evidence had been destroyed, that the hotel's famous discretion had crossed the line into conspiracy. The hotel never acknowledged the incident publicly. The bungalow was cleaned, redecorated, and rented to new guests, as if nothing had happened. Staff members who had worked that night either quit or learned not to discuss what they had seen. The woman's name appeared in a few gossip columns, then faded from memory. But among longtime residents and industry insiders, the story became part of the hotel's oral history. Something dark had happened in the Pink Palace, and the walls had absorbed the secret. The incident marked a turning point. Through the mid-1960s, the hotel began to lose its grip on Hollywood's imagination. The studio system was collapsing. A new generation of filmmakers was emerging. Directors who had no interest in the old power structures and no patience for the rituals of the Polo Lounge. Young actors preferred the counterculture enclaves of Laurel Canyon to the manicured luxury of Beverly Hills. The hotel that had defined Hollywood glamour for half a century suddenly seemed like a relic. Attendance at the Polo Lounge declined. The bungalows sat empty for weeks at a time. The once immaculate grounds showed signs of deferred maintenance. The property was still profitable, but the cultural dominance was slipping away. In 1954, the hotel had been sold to Ben Silberstein for $5.5 million, approximately $62 million today. Silberstein had made his fortune in real estate and oil. He understood the value of the property, but he also recognized that its glory days might be ending. When he died in 1976, his estate faced a difficult decision: sell while it still had value, or hold on and hope for cultural revival. The family chose to sell. In 1979, they accepted an offer from Marvin Davis, an oil man from Denver, who paid $135 million for the property, approximately $565 million in today's currency. Davis promised to restore the hotel to its former glory. He pledged $100 million for renovations. The Beverly Hills Hotel, he declared, would once again become the center of Hollywood. Davis kept his promise. He spent lavishly on restoration. The bungalows were gutted and rebuilt with modern amenities while preserving their original charm. The Polo Lounge was redecorated in the style of an English gentleman's club. The gardens were replanted with even more exotic specimens. Fresh coats of that signature pink paint covered every surface. By the time Davis finished in 1982, the hotel looked as magnificent as it had in its 1950s heyday. But Davis also made a decision that would nearly destroy everything he had built. In 1987, he sold the Beverly Hills Hotel for $200 million to a buyer whose identity would spark immediate controversy. The new owner was Sultan Hassan al-Bolkiah of Brunei, one of the wealthiest men in the world. His small nation on the island of Borneo sat atop vast oil and natural gas reserves that had made the royal family incomprehensibly rich. The Sultan's personal fortune was estimated at $20 billion. He collected Rolls-Royces the way other people collected stamps. He owned palaces across Asia and Europe. Now he owned the Beverly Hills Hotel. At first, the sale seemed like a blessing. The Sultan promised to maintain the property's standards. He pledged to preserve its character. He assured Hollywood that nothing would change. For several years, his promises held. The hotel continued to operate as it always had. The Polo Lounge remained packed with industry executives. The bungalows stayed booked. The pink facade continued to dominate Sunset Boulevard. But in 2014, the Sultan's government enacted a series of laws that would transform the Beverly Hills Hotel from Hollywood's throne room into its most controversial property. Brunei adopted a strict interpretation of Sharia law that included punishments widely condemned by human rights organizations. The new penal code called for death by stoning for adultery and homosexuality. It mandated flogging for alcohol consumption and pregnancy outside marriage. The laws applied to both citizens and visitors to Brunei, creating an international outcry. The connection to the Beverly Hills Hotel was immediate and undeniable. The Sultan owned the property through his investment company, the Brunei Investment Agency. Revenue from the hotel flowed directly into the royal treasury of a government that had just criminalized homosexuality with the death penalty. To stay at the Beverly Hills Hotel, critics argued, was to financially support a regime that murdered gay people. Hollywood, an industry that had loudly championed LGBTQ rights, faced an impossible situation. The hotel that had sheltered the industry's secrets for a century now represented values that contradicted everything modern Hollywood claimed to believe. The response was swift and severe. Jay Leno, the comedian and former Tonight Show host, was the first major figure to speak out. He called for a boycott of all Brunei-owned properties, which included not just the Beverly Hills Hotel, but also the Hotel Bel Air and several luxury properties in London and Paris. Other celebrities quickly joined. Ellen DeGeneres, Richard Branson, and Stephen Fry all announced they would no longer patronize the hotel. The Human Rights Campaign, the largest LGBTQ advocacy organization in America, officially called for a boycott. The boycott devastated the hotel's business. Major talent agencies canceled their regular meetings at the Polo Lounge. The Motion Picture and Television Fund moved its annual fundraiser to another venue. The Feminist Majority Foundation relocated its awards ceremony. conference organizers who had booked the hotel's ballrooms for years found different locations. Within months, the hotel that had been the center of Hollywood's social calendar became a ghost town. The staff suffered most. Many employees had worked at the hotel for decades. Some had spent their entire careers there. They had nothing to do with the Sultan's policies in Brunei, but they watched their tips disappear as the boycott emptied the dining rooms and canceled reservations. Housekeepers who had once serviced fully booked floors found themselves cleaning empty rooms. Bartenders who had served Hollywood's elite now served occasional tourists who either did not know about the boycott or did not care. The hotel's management tried to contain the damage. They issued statements emphasizing that the property's employees were Americans who shared Hollywood's values. They pointed out that the hotel had a diverse staff that included many LGBTQ workers. They argued that boycotting the hotel only hurt innocent people while doing nothing to change policies in Brunei. The arguments made no difference. The financial impact was catastrophic. Industry sources estimated the hotel lost tens of millions of dollars in revenue during the first year alone. Occupancy rates plummeted from above 80% to below 40%. The bungalows, which once required reservations months in advance, sat empty for weeks. The Polo Lounge, which had defined power in Hollywood for 70 years, served lunch to scattered tables of tourists. Some defended the hotel. They argued that boycotts rarely achieved their stated goals and often harmed the wrong people. They pointed out that many protesters had no problem doing business with other countries that violated human rights. They noted that the Sultan would not suffer financially from the boycott. His oil revenues dwarfed whatever he earned from the hotel. The only people truly hurt were the workers. But the boycott's supporters countered that principles mattered more than convenience. They argued that Hollywood had spent decades hiding its compromises behind closed doors, and that the time had come to take a public stand. The Beverly Hills Hotel, they said, was a perfect target precisely because it had meant so much to the industry for so long. To abandon it was to send a message that some values could not be bought at any price. The boycott also forced Hollywood to confront its own complicated relationship with the property. For decades, the hotel had protected powerful men who abused their positions. It had sheltered affairs that destroyed families. It had provided cover for drug use, illegal gambling, and financial crimes. The industry had celebrated this discretion when it served their interests. Now, when discretion protected a foreign government's oppression, suddenly silence was unacceptable. The contrast did not go unnoticed. Critics pointed out that many celebrities who loudly boycotted the hotel had previously ignored human rights violations by other business partners. Hollywood had long maintained profitable relationships with countries whose governments imprisoned dissidents, censored artists, and denied basic freedoms. The Beverly Hills Hotel had simply become a convenient target. The Sultan showed no signs of selling. He had paid $200 million for the property in 1987. By 2014, it was worth at least $500 million, possibly more. The hotel generated revenue even during the boycott. The Sultan could afford to wait out the protesters. As the boycott stretched from months into years, the hotel's emptiness became its own kind of monument. The Pink Palace still dominated Sunset Boulevard. The grounds remained immaculate. But the cultural power it had wielded for a century was gone. The boycott reached its peak intensity in 2015 and 2016. Protest groups organized demonstrations outside the hotel's entrance on Sunset Boulevard. Activists distributed flyers to passing tourists, explaining why they should avoid the property. Social media campaigns encouraged travelers to book elsewhere. The Pink Palace had become Hollywood's most visible moral battleground. Inside the hotel, the staff tried to maintain normalcy. Rooms were cleaned whether guests occupied them or not. The Polo Lounge served breakfast to whoever came through the doors. The gardens were maintained with the same care they had received for decades. But the sense of abandonment was inescapable. A hotel designed for crowds felt haunted when empty. Some longtime guests continued to patronize the property despite the boycott. They were mostly older industry veterans who remembered when the hotel had been the center of their professional lives. They resented being told where they could and could not spend their money. They argued that personal loyalty to the staff mattered more than symbolic gestures. But even these defenders came less frequently as the social pressure mounted. The hotel attempted various strategies to survive. Management offered steep discounts to fill rooms. They marketed aggressively to international tourists who knew nothing about the boycott. They emphasized the property's history and architectural significance, hoping heritage tourism could replace the industry business they had lost. None of it restored what had been taken away. By 2017, the boycott had become self-sustaining. Even people who disagreed with it avoided the hotel because everyone else avoided it. The property had become culturally radioactive. To be seen entering the Beverly Hills Hotel was to invite criticism and questions. It was easier to simply go somewhere else. The hotel's predicament raised uncomfortable questions about how far moral responsibility extends. The staff had no control over the Sultan's policies. The management team in Los Angeles could not influence decisions made in Brunei, yet they all suffered the consequences of choices made by people they would never meet. The boycott punished proximity rather than culpability. Some employees quit out of frustration or financial necessity. Others stayed, hoping the boycott would eventually end. They had invested decades in their careers at the hotel. They had expertise that was not easily transferable to other properties. They waited and hoped that Hollywood's attention span would prove as short as its memory. The situation also exposed the limitations of celebrity activism. Many stars who loudly supported the boycott continued to work with companies that did business in countries with equally troubling human rights records. Film studios maintained distribution deals with authoritarian governments. Luxury brands manufactured products in nations that suppressed free speech. Tech companies built infrastructure for surveillance states, but the Beverly Hills Hotel became the singular focus of outrage because it was visible, accessible, and symbolically important. Meanwhile, in Brunei, the Sultan showed no signs of reconsidering his policies. The international criticism had no apparent effect on his government's actions. The boycott that had devastated a hotel in Los Angeles did not change a single law in Brunei. The only tangible result was empty rooms and unemployed workers thousands of miles from the policies they were being punished for. By 2019, the boycott had lasted 5 years. The hotel's occupancy had stabilized at levels far below its historical averages, but high enough to remain operational. The property still turned a profit, though nothing like the returns it had generated before 2014. The Sultan, whose net worth was estimated at over $28 billion, could afford to wait indefinitely. Hollywood moved on to other causes. The industry's attention shifted to newer controversies. Some of the celebrities who had led the boycott quietly resumed attending events at other Brunei-owned properties. The moral clarity that had seemed so absolute in 2014 had softened into pragmatic compromise. But the damage to the Beverly Hills Hotel persisted. The hotel that had defined Hollywood glamour had become a cautionary tale about the price of association. For more than a century, the Pink Palace had succeeded by offering discretion, luxury, and access to power. The boycott revealed that these qualities could no longer protect an institution when the political winds shifted. The same industry that had once valued the hotel's willingness to look the other way now condemned it for exactly that tendency. The story of the Beverly Hills Hotel had always been about more than architecture and amenities. It had been about power and access, about who got to decide what mattered and what could be ignored. The boycott forced a reckoning with that history. The hotel had survived because it served powerful people. When those people decided it no longer served their interests, survival became uncertain. As the boycott entered its sixth year in 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic struck. Hotels across the world closed or operated at minimal capacity. Travel ceased. Events were canceled. The Beverly Hills Hotel, already weakened by years of boycott, faced a new existential threat. The Pink Palace that had survived depressions, wars, and cultural revolutions now confronted a global crisis, with its reputation in ruins and its finances precarious. The pandemic forced the Beverly Hills Hotel to close its doors for the first time in its history. On March 17, 2020, California Governor Gavin Newsom issued a statewide shelter-in-place order. Within days, the hotel suspended operations. The Pink Palace that had never stopped serving guests through 2 world wars and the Great Depression went dark. The closure lasted 4 months. During that time, the property sat empty, except for essential maintenance staff. The gardens continued to be watered. The buildings were cleaned. But no guests wandered the grounds. No deals were made in the Polo Lounge. The bungalows stood vacant. For the first time since 1912, silence settled over the 12 acres. When the hotel reopened in July of 2020, it faced a transformed world. International travel had collapsed. Business conferences had moved online. The entertainment industry had largely shut down production. The few people who needed hotel rooms could choose from dozens of properties desperate for business. The Beverly Hills Hotel, already weakened by 6 years of boycott, now competed in a market where every establishment struggled to survive. The pandemic had an unexpected effect on the boycott. With Hollywood focused on survival rather than activism, the protests faded. The demonstrations outside the hotel stopped. Social media campaigns moved on to other issues. The moral outrage that had sustained the boycott for years simply evaporated as people confronted more immediate crises. The hotel benefited not from forgiveness, but from irrelevance. As travel slowly resumed in 2021 and 2022, the Beverly Hills Hotel discovered it had been granted a strange reprieve. A new generation of visitors had no memory of the boycott's intensity. Younger travelers knew the property primarily through Instagram, where the pink walls and tropical gardens photographed beautifully. Influencers began posting from the hotel again. Their millions of followers saw only aesthetics, not politics. The hotel's management recognized the opportunity. They invested heavily in social media marketing, emphasizing the property's visual appeal rather than its controversial ownership. They partnered with luxury brands for promotional events. They offered package deals that included spa treatments and dining experiences. They repositioned the Beverly Hills Hotel as an Instagram destination rather than a Hollywood institution. The strategy worked better than anyone expected. By 2023, occupancy had recovered to levels not seen since before the boycott began. The bungalows were booked months in advance. The Polo Lounge served meals to capacity crowds. The hotel had not regained its position as Hollywood's throne room, but it had found a different kind of relevance. For a different era. The recovery revealed something uncomfortable about modern activism. The boycott that had seemed so morally necessary in 2014 had been abandoned, not because the Sultan changed his policies, but because people simply stopped caring. Brunei's laws remained unchanged. The hotel's ownership remained unchanged. What changed was public attention. Some of the original boycott supporters were disturbed by this development. They argued that resuming business with the hotel represented a moral failure, a capitulation to convenience over principle. They pointed out that the Sultan's government still maintained the same oppressive laws that had sparked the boycott. Nothing had been resolved. The problem had simply been forgotten. But others saw the boycott's collapse as inevitable. They had always argued that celebrity activism was performative rather than principled, designed to generate positive publicity rather than achieve concrete change. The pandemic had proved their point. When maintaining the boycott became inconvenient, it disappeared. the lesson was clear. Moral stands lasted only as long as they served the self-interest of those taking them. The hotel's staff, who had suffered through years of empty rooms and reduced tips, mostly felt relief. They had never asked to become symbols in someone else's political battle. They had simply wanted to do their jobs and support their families. The return of guests meant the return of income. Whatever moral complexities surrounded the hotel's ownership, they needed to pay rent. The recovery also demonstrated the limits of boycotts as tools for social change. The Beverly Hills Hotel had been targeted because it was visible, prestigious, and vulnerable to public pressure. The campaign had succeeded in damaging the property's business, but it had failed to achieve its stated goal of forcing the Sultan to change Brunei's laws. The Sultan, insulated by billions of dollars in oil wealth, had simply waited out the protesters. In the end, the boycott hurt American workers far more than it hurt a Southeast Asian monarch. By 2024, the hotel had largely escaped its pariah status. A new generation of celebrities began holding events there, again. Studios booked the ballrooms for premieres and parties. Industry executives returned to the Polo Lounge for breakfast meetings. The Pink Palace was being welcomed back into Hollywood's embrace, not because anyone had forgotten what happened, but because forgetting had proven easier than remembering. The hotel's resurrection raised questions about institutional memory and collective responsibility. The building itself had not changed, the ownership had not changed, the laws in Brunei had not changed. What had changed was whether anyone felt obligated to care. The boycott's collapse suggested that moral outrage, no matter how loudly expressed, had a limited shelf life in a culture defined by short attention spans and perpetual distraction. The hotel's path back from controversy required more than simply waiting for people to forget. Management understood they needed to actively rebuild the property's reputation while acknowledging its complicated history. The approach they adopted was strategic silence, combined with visual reinvention. Rather than defend the Sultan's ownership or apologize for the boycott, the hotel simply stopped discussing politics entirely. Press inquiries about Brunei went unanswered. Requests for statements were politely declined. The property presented itself as an architectural landmark and luxury destination, nothing more. The strategy worked because it allowed guests to return without having to publicly defend their choice. The hotel also invested millions in renovations designed to refresh its image without erasing its history. The bungalows received complete interior overhauls. Modern technology was installed throughout the property. The Polo Lounge was redesigned to feel simultaneously classic and contemporary. The changes signaled that this was not the same hotel that had been boycotted, even though legally and structurally nothing fundamental had changed. The physical transformation mattered less than the cultural one. The Beverly Hills Hotel had always succeeded by reading the zeitgeist and adapting to it. In the 1940s, that meant creating the Polo Lounge for industry power brokers. In the 1950s, it meant providing bungalows for stars seeking privacy. In the 2020s, it meant becoming an Instagram destination for a generation that valued aesthetics over history. The hotel's social media presence exploded. Professional photographers were hired to capture the property's most photogenic angles. Influencers were invited to stay in exchange for posts. The distinctive pink facade appeared in thousands of photos shared across platforms. For young travelers planning trips to Los Angeles, the Beverly Hills Hotel became a must-visit location not because of its history, but because of how it looked on a phone screen. This transition from institutional power center to visual destination marked a fundamental shift in what the hotel represented. For most of its existence, the Beverly Hills Hotel had mattered because of who stayed there and what happened behind closed doors. The discretion that protected those secrets was the source of its value. But in an era where privacy had become nearly impossible and social media turned private moments into public performances, discretion no longer carried the same premium. The hotel adapted by embracing visibility rather than secrecy. The grounds that had once been carefully shielded from photographers now welcomed them. The pink walls that had witnessed a century of confidential meetings became backdrops for public displays. The property that had built its reputation on knowing when to look away now built it on being looked at. Some longtime industry figures lamented the change. They remembered when the Beverly Hills Hotel had been a sanctuary, a place where business could be conducted and affairs managed without fear of exposure. The new openness felt like a betrayal of everything the hotel had represented, but their complaints carried little weight. The industry itself had changed. The studio system that had made the Polo Lounge essential no longer existed. The kind of consolidated power that required discrete meeting spaces had fragmented into 1,000 smaller operations. The hotel's traditional function had become obsolete before the boycott ever began. The property's recovery also benefited from broader cultural amnesia about the boycott itself. By 2024, many of the celebrities who had led the campaign had moved on to other causes or simply stopped discussing it. Some had been accused of hypocrisy for continuing to work with other morally compromised entities. Others had discovered that sustained activism was harder than momentary outrage. The boycott faded because maintaining it required energy that people were unwilling to spend. The hotel's staff, who had lived through the entire crisis, developed their own understanding of what had happened. They had watched their workplace become a political symbol overnight. They had suffered financially for decisions they had no part in making. They had witnessed the boycott's intensity and its eventual collapse. Many came away with deep cynicism about celebrity activism and moral posturing. They had learned that principles were flexible and that outrage had an expiration date. The Beverly Hills Hotel's survival also depended on one undeniable fact. It occupied some of the most valuable real estate in Los Angeles. The 12 acres at Sunset and Rodeo Drive were worth hundreds of millions of dollars, regardless of what building sat on them. The Sultan could afford to lose money on the hotel indefinitely because the land itself was an appreciating asset. Even if the property never regained its former glory, it would retain enormous value. By 2025, the hotel had fully resumed operations at pre-boycott levels. Room rates ranged from $700 per night for standard accommodations to over $10,000 for the most exclusive bungalows, prices comparable to other luxury properties in Los Angeles. The Polo Lounge once again required reservations days in advance. Industry events returned to the ballrooms. The Pink Palace had reclaimed its place in Hollywood's landscape. But the hotel that emerged from the boycott was fundamentally different from the one that had entered it. The institutional power it had wielded for decades had evaporated. The cultural centrality it had enjoyed had shifted elsewhere. What remained was a beautiful building with a complicated history, serving a clientele that valued aesthetics and luxury over the deeper meanings the property had once embodied. The recovery process revealed harsh truths about institutional survival in the modern era. Loyalty meant nothing when maintaining it became inconvenient. Moral principles could be discarded when they conflicted with personal desires. Public memory lasted only as long as the next scandal. The Beverly Hills Hotel had survived not by changing anything fundamental about itself, but by outlasting its critics' attention spans. Today, the Beverly Hills Hotel stands exactly where it has stood since 1912. The salmon pink facade still dominates the corner of Sunset and Rodeo Drive. The 12 acres of tropical gardens still flourish in a climate that should not support them. The bungalows still offer privacy to guests who can afford their rates. From the outside, very little has changed. But the building's relationship to Hollywood has been permanently altered. The hotel is no longer where power resides. It is where power occasionally visits. The Polo Lounge still serves breakfast, but the deals that shape the entertainment industry now happen in conference rooms, at streaming companies, and technology firms. The bungalows still host celebrities, but their affairs are more likely to be exposed on social media than protected by hotel staff. The discretion that defined the property for a century has become impossible to maintain in an age of constant surveillance and instant communication. The hotel's survival raises questions about what institutions mean and whether their meaning can survive radical changes in context. The Beverly Hills Hotel was built to serve a specific Hollywood, one dominated by a handful of studios and defined by careful control of public image. That Hollywood no longer exists. The industry has fragmented into hundreds of production companies, streaming platforms, and independent creators. The centralized power that made the Polo Lounge essential has dissipated. Yet the building endures. It endures partly because of its location, partly because of its architecture, and partly because some stories are too good to let die. The Beverly Hills Hotel has become a monument to its own history, a place where people go not because they need to, but because the name carries weight. That weight is no longer power. It is nostalgia. Walk through the lobby today, and you will see tourists photographing the pink walls, influencers staging content in the gardens, wealthy travelers from around the world who want to experience a piece of Hollywood mythology. You might also see a few industry veterans having lunch in the Polo Lounge, but they are outnumbered by people who have no connection to the entertainment business and do not particularly care about the hotel's complicated past. The staff who work there now have mostly joined since the boycott ended. They know the history in outline but did not live through the crisis. For them, the Beverly Hills Hotel is simply a workplace, one that happens to be famous and occasionally controversial. They change the linens, serve the meals, maintain the grounds, and go home at the end of their shifts. The mythology that surrounds the property exists separate from their daily experience of it. The hotel's story forces a reckoning with uncomfortable questions about complicity and responsibility. For more than a century, the Beverly Hills Hotel protected powerful people who used that protection to hide affairs, crimes, and corruption. The industry that now condemned the hotel for its ownership had previously celebrated it for exactly that discretion. The moral outrage that fueled the boycott was selective at best and hypocritical at worst. But the boycott also revealed something genuine about changing values. Hollywood in 2014 was different from Hollywood in 1954 or 1914. The industry that had once valued privacy above principle had been forced by social movements and public pressure to at least perform commitment to civil rights. The Beverly Hills Hotel became a test of whether that commitment meant anything. The test revealed that commitment was real enough to cause economic damage, but not strong enough to last. The building itself bears witness to all of it. The walls that once absorbed the sounds of opera practice now absorb the clicks of smartphone cameras. The bungalows that sheltered Hollywood legends now host Instagram influencers. The Polo Lounge that brokered studio contracts now serves brunch to tourists. The hotel has survived by becoming something different while looking exactly the same. There is a lesson in that survival about the nature of institutions. They persist not because they maintain their original purpose, but because they adapt to serve new ones. The Beverly Hills Hotel no longer defines Hollywood power because Hollywood power no longer needs definition. It has scattered into 1,000 locations and exists primarily in contracts negotiated by email and Zoom. But the hotel still offers something valuable. It offers a connection to a mythical past, a chance to walk where legends walked, to sit where deals were made, to sleep in beds where stars once slept. Whether that is enough to sustain an institution for another century remains uncertain. The hotel faces challenges that have nothing to do with boycotts or politics. Los Angeles is changing. The city that once revolved around the entertainment industry now hosts technology companies, finance firms, and international corporations. The next generation of wealthy travelers may not care about Hollywood history. They may prefer hotels that reflect contemporary values rather than nostalgic ones. The Sultan still owns the property. His investment company shows no interest in selling. the hotel remains profitable enough to justify holding it as a long-term asset. The land alone guarantees its value. Whatever happens to the building, the 12 acres at Sunset and Rodeo will always be worth hundreds of millions of dollars. But buildings are more than real estate. They are stories made physical. The Beverly Hills Hotel's story is about ambition and accommodation, about power and its limits, about how institutions serve the powerful until power shifts elsewhere. It is about discretion maintained until discretion becomes complicity. It is about survival purchased at the cost of meaning. The Pink Palace stands as a monument to American celebrity culture, to all its glamour and all its compromises. It has witnessed romance and betrayal, genius and scandal, triumph and tragedy. It has sheltered presidents and criminals, artists and frauds. It has survived depressions, wars, boycotts, and a pandemic. It survives still, not as Hollywood's throne room, not as the center of American entertainment, but as a beautiful building with a complicated history, offering luxury to anyone willing to pay for it and overlook where the money goes. The walls no longer protect secrets. They simply stand, salmon pink against the California sky, adding chapters to a story that refuses to end. The Beverly Hills Hotel, where dreams were made and compromises were hidden, where power gathered and eventually scattered, where Hollywood learned to be Hollywood, then learned to be something else. Still standing, still pink, still there.